Bro, I swear, if I get locked by I'ma cut ya, and then right after getting locked by I'ma cut ya, I have quaking spawn on top of me, then right after that I have thundering circles on top of me, I am going to be incredibly, incredibly upset.
Well, that's something that could happen. Yeah, it's actually kind of interesting, the overlap between this seasonal affix and some of the other affixes, and that's one of the things we're going to be talking about in this video, which is about affixes in general, right? Like all of the affixes we've got, how they're interacting with each other, with the seasonal,
Yeah.
with like everything, right?
I think so. I think community sentiment on affixes has changed a lot this season more than ever. It's been super interesting. I think I've seen a lot of posts, a lot of tweets. You know, people are on the forums as well talking about affixes. Now, this is nothing new in the sense of like, you know, most seasons people complain about, you know, the seasonal affix being too hard. They complain about, you know, necrotic was perennially complained about until it eventually got removed. There's always a couple of affixes that hit people the wrong way, and they're like, okay, this is super annoying. They need to remove this. They need to delete tyrannical and fortified. I'm pretty sure you and I have made a video talking about deleting tyrannical and fortified before. This is nothing new that people are talking about affixes, but I think that people are finally taking a different approach to talking about the affix structure as a whole. One of the things that you and I discussed in an earlier video about just M+ and what it was going to look like in Season 1 was the shrinking of the affix rotation from 12 weeks to 10 weeks. They removed Inspiring and Necrotic, which we both hailed as, you know, pretty good things because those affixes were annoying and toxic. And the problem still persists. What do you think the biggest problem with affixes are right now? Because I have a theory.
So I'm not actually that down on like affixes as a whole compared to you know, you or a lot of other folks in the community. I think that looking at affixes right now, like I do think having 2 affixes on each key besides fortified in the seasonal is good. I think that there are a few different problems that I would diagnose this season with, and one of them is thundering.
Okay.
Thundering has negative interactions with a lot of the other affixes and is also just, in my opinion, never like a fun affix to really have on a key. But thundering, quaking, as you mentioned, thundering, storming, you know, you're trying to clear, there's stormings in the way, disaster there. So I think thundering is causing a lot of the angst here because it's like always like a high maintenance affix. Thundering volcanic, even like there's a lot of times where it just kind of feels unfair or unfun to play around. And the fact that the best way to counter thundering is just clear early in case something like that happens, and then you've got this affix that's kind of just not doing anything good. So I think that's part of the problem. I think another thing to look at is the removal of Inspiring and Necrotic. Those affixes, I agree, were good to go, but that leaves all of these weeks having, like, all of the other affixes are basically like the mobs do some more damage or there's more to heal, right? Like there's something your healer has to watch out for, right? Something like that. So Necrotic and Inspiring were kind of the 2 big tank affixes or tank/DPS affixes. I guess bolstering still a little bit of that, but even still bolstering, you just bolster something big, make your healer heal it, right, for a little while. So I guess I would diagnose this season with those problems in particular. I would say, like, if you look at Tyrannical and Fortified, IMO Tyrannical and Fortified is in a pretty good place right now. Like I used to be on the delete Tyrannical train, and now I think those affixes are doing a fine job of differentiating week to week, and neither feeling like super hateful.
I would tend to agree with that. I think that Dratnos diagnosed with what his problems were. Generally, what I and other people end up saying is like the affixes just as a whole are too impactful. Now, it's not a situation where I don't think anybody's okay. There's some people who are saying this, but not very many people are saying that all affixes should go. They're not healthy for the game, that kind of thing. Most people understand that, like, if there were no affixes in the dungeon, it would be boring. You know, there is some value in week to week variance, but we have hit a state with this season where every single week you come off of that week happy that you were no longer playing on the previous week, and then immediately upset that you were currently playing on the new week. And that's a weird situation that I don't know if I've ever felt, where it's not like, okay, this week is unplayable, because Blizzard, to their credit, they've done a good job of balancing the affixes versus one another. That was one of the biggest complaints for a long time, is that the affixes were imbalanced relative to one another. And, you know, bolstering took a bunch of nerfs since inception, including now being like falling off. It has a duration. You know, there's also things such as Raging used to not be, or there used to not be soothes in the game, and now they've added the ability to be able to remove raging off of mobs. Storming used to not get eaten up by once one player hit it. Now it gets consumed. That's pretty consistent with all affixes, that they've been nerfed in some capacity, and now they're relatively balanced against one another. And there's still the situation where you come off of the previous week, at least for me and for other players, and you start playing the new week, and you're like, gosh, these new week's affixes are also not fun. And you're like, okay, well, why? And I think that, like, in my mind, I have diagnosed that the affixes are just as a whole too impactful, but it's in the sense of, like, we have too many of them. And so we end up playing the affixes more than we end up playing the dungeon. And that, I feel like, at least for me, is a little bit of a miss.
Yeah, so again, I have felt some of that, like, oh, thank goodness it's not last week. Oh no, it's this week.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like that's such a weird one. I was like, I've never felt that before.
I mean, I do think that's probably just part of a side effect as well of, like, not having push week, dead week dichotomy, where, like, you just take a week off, right? And then you have, like, a good week, and that had its own problems that I think were worse. I also think that a lot of that comes down to Thundering making some of these affixes feel as bad as they do. I also think you can look at dungeon design. Like, you were talking about the quaking, I'm a cut you lock. Like, you have these dungeons that all have these, like, interrupting cloud burst on the last boss of Ruby life pools. You know, you have the interrupt in court. A lot of mobs will just do this thing where it's like, oh, you have to stop casting or it's going to lock you. And then you have quaking on top of that, right? You have, you know,
thundering wise Mari. It's like, okay, this boss was not designed for thundering. Oh my god, am I gonna get stunned or am I gonna get wash away? Like, okay,
yeah,
wow.
Or like thundering swirlies on last boss not good offensive. It's just the same color as the swirlies from the boss, right? And that are exploding at different times from each other and stuff. And it's I think it is a case of the affix design space. They've encroached on it with their mob design space in some of these dungeons, with the quaking stop casting thing. And then when you get those two combined, it's particularly nasty. So, but I don't know, I don't know how much that is a problem with affixes, or because, like, a lot of that was added to these. Quarter Stars didn't used to have that. Quarter Stars didn't used to have the interrupting thing from I Cut Ya. That was added this expansion, right? That wasn't in old Quarter Stars. That's a new feature of that dungeon. So
it's, to me, I do worry. Okay, part of me thinks, yes, maybe this is something to do with the dungeons themselves, but I worry about dwarfing the design space for dungeons and making less cool dungeons because, okay, this affix interacts poorly with the dungeon. And we've seen how many changes to quaking or explosives spawning off of mobs, or mobs that weren't supposed to rage still, and, like, stuff like that since the season started. Like, we've had four different bosses get changed to where they just clear quaking at random points to make sure that you're not going to get a bad overlap. That to me seems like, okay, we are now, it's not necessarily about encroaching on mechanics. It's more like, I just don't know if these affixes should interact that way with the dungeon itself.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess my take on this is kind of the other way around, where it's like, if they just picked another 10 bosses and, like, expand and added no quaking windows to those bosses, or, like, to mobs that have interrupts already, and then, like, if they took, you know, Wise Mari and nerfed how often storming spawned on that boss in particular. If they took, like, explosive spawns on certain really large pulls. I actually just think in general explosive should have, like, logarithmic scaling with the number of mobs in the pack much more aggressively, and that would fix it just as a general case. But I think if they were to do specific targeted affix nerfs on the packs that the affixes are worst on, that would be good. I think that would be something that doing more of that would be good rather than bad, rather than, like, an indicator that there's a problem.
Okay, I guess moving forward, do you want to talk about jobs and how the affixes get divvied up by role, or do you want to talk about just the affixes specifically next? I think we have both to cover. We can go either direction.
Let's do jobs. Let's break up the affix talk with a little bit of jobs, because I guess my take earlier was basically that a lot of this does land on your healer, right?
Yes, and I think that that's almost universally true. So if you take a look at the affixes just in general, Grievous, obviously almost strictly a healer affix. Explosive, almost strictly a healer affix.
Well, so
Bursting, almost strictly a healer affix as well.
describing explosive as a healer only affix that's true for like people doing 20 or higher keys, but or like in coordinated groups, but like that's not actually the case in most people who do Mythic Plus in the game. Like the explosives are whoever the best player is in the group is looking at them, and like if you're anybody in any group that is pugging, you're always going to help the groups win by killing them. But yeah, like particularly in the coordinated groups, yeah, it's like what's the best answer to explosive? It's your healer globals, right? What's the best answer to any of these affix? It's healer globals, because those are your least valuable globals to give away.
And those are almost 100% in my experience healer affixes. And so then you have half the weeks on the calendar that are in some form or another just healer weeks, and then you have obviously things such as quaking, which does impact your healing in some capacity, but more often than not, it's like it can be a lot of nothing. More comes down to the week itself. Volcanic is the fakest affix ever, but it's not like necessarily a job. And then you're left with the other job affixes, which are bolstering and sanguine, and then a little bit of raging. Which bolstering and sanguine, those are mostly like DPS. Okay, bolstering is DPS affix. Sanguine, more often than not, that's on your tank. Now, there are ways to interact with sanguine with knockbacks and stuff like that, but more often than not, that's going to be mostly on your tank, and then raging is on both your tank and people who have soothes in your group in some capacity. But a lot of this is just healer based, right? And I don't think that there is a week that the healer is not interacting with just the dungeon itself.
Yeah, and a lot of these affixes that aren't like the healer's job, it ends up being the person whose ability specifically counters this affix's job, right? Like the Mass Dispel on bursting, the Soothe on raging, right? And it's not like landing on like the DPS role, it's landing on just the specific class. Even bolstering, that like in theory is a DPS job, in practice, like your DPS can kind of ignore bolstering, and they're not the people who suffer for it, right?
Well, I would also claim that it's like the tank job more than it is a DPS job in a lot of situations, because the tank has so much control over the group and they have control with what you're pulling. And so like in some capacity, it's also the tank's job to make sure that the packs are set up in a way where you're not going to bolster them up. But like I think that for most players, it's like a DPS job, like DPS these mobs evenly kind of thing.
Yeah, I wonder if there's room for affixes that like the penalty for messing them up isn't damage, but is like damage reduction on the people that mess up the affix somehow. I wonder if that's like a way to make an affix that punishes a DPS rather than a healer when it's done badly. But I don't know, I could see that being pretty unfun feeling depending on how often that was applied to you. So
like what, Spiteful slows you as opposed to doing damage to you whenever you get meleeed by it?
Yeah, like you get hit by a Spiteful and it's like, oh no, for the next 10 seconds I have 50% less haste and movement speed or something, right? And
okay.
It's like, this sucks. I should have ran away from that spirit, rather than like, oh, I got hit for 80% of my health, heal me or I die, right? I don't know. I'm not sure. This is kind of we've had this discussion about damage downs before on, I think on our podcast, the post that Megaset made, and that's something that I've been thinking about maybe being applicable to affixes as well.
My general read, though, is like, even though these are jobs, these become so complicated and convoluted in a lot of situations that you need... Okay, we are coming into these expansions, we're coming into these patches with years at this point of M+ experience. There are players who are just jumping into M+ for the first time, or maybe it's their second season or something like that, and they don't have this backlog of just, okay, we know how to deal with this affix. We already have affix knowledge just as a whole. We know how everything functionally is going to look with these affixes, and so we're not super worried about that. There are a lot of players that the affix is so much an overwhelming part of the dungeon that learning that, especially on the fly, especially for new players, isn't very straightforward. And I think that that's one of my biggest concerns. And that's why I think that there are too many affixes just generally. And I think that like maybe cutting down on the rows, like maybe removing one of these rows of affixes could do a lot of good. Just trying to increase the accessibility of being able to do the dungeons and focusing more on the dungeons as the part that we're looking at, as opposed to just looking at, okay, affixes are, I don't want to say most of the dungeon, because I don't think affixes are ever most of the dungeon, but affixes are like half the dungeon that you have to deal with, as opposed to the dungeon being 75%.
Yeah, I guess first of all, like I wouldn't mind seeing some experimentation in that space, but for me, this is the biggest thing, is like the seasonal affix is really important. It's really important.
The seasonal affix has to be good, right?
Yeah, I think this season we're seeing the domino effect of a problematic seasonal affix. on a lot of these other factors, and I think it would be a lot would be fixed with a different seasonal. But yeah, I mean, I do empathize. Like, I don't think affixes are in a perfect place or anything, but in general, I think that having the number we have is, I imagine, would be better than having less. But maybe, I mean, I would be down to try. At this point, I'm willing to see like experimentation with almost anything in any given season, because I just think it's cool to have things change and try different stuff out rather than just like theorizing about it and never giving it another try. So I'd be down to see it for season.
I think that fewer weeks of rotation would almost be a mistake in my mind. I think that like fewer, if we cut this down to 6 weeks or something like that, I feel like that wouldn't be as.
I don't
fun.
think less weeks is good.
I agree
with the same number of affixes. Like I already am feeling the smaller number of weeks.
Okay,
maybe not much, but I think going from 10 to 6 would be bad.
Just to make sure it's not a 30-minute video, let's hit the affixes individually real quick.
Okay.
Thundering, we kind of alluded to. I don't think that either of us think that Thundering is a particularly good affix. We've talked about it a couple times like in videos. Yeah, it's a D on Dratnos' tier list. I think that we called it a 3 or a 2 out of 10 before.
It's not good.
I think that there are some elements to Thundering that are okay, but even if played perfectly, I'm never happy with Thundering. And then worst case scenario, I've accidentally wiped my group because I didn't clear, because I wasn't being preemptive enough with the clearing. And I think that Thundering is too punishing for the game and not fun, which again, my lens for the game is like, I normally ask myself, is this fun? Would this make the game more enjoyable? And if the answer is yes, then I think that that's normally the way to go. And I think that Thundering goes almost against that, where it's like, okay, this is not fun.
Okay, how about Fortified and Tyrant? How are you feeling about those two right now? Because I said my bit. I think they're pretty good right now. How do you feel?
As time has gone on, I've been more and more okay with these affixes. They actually do an okay job right now of making the weeks feel unique. I think specifically Algathor Academy is a great example of that for me, where Croth and Veximus feel like they are bigger time sinks, and they are also functionally a lot harder on Tyrannical than they are on Fortified. But then on Fortified weeks, you have to battle the trash, and the trash pulls are, 15 seconds longer a piece. And these are noticeable. These are noticeable differences, and it's not in a way that I feel like one week is significantly easier than the other. And I think that has always been the complaint in the past, but I think that the change to dungeon score, forcing players to play both Fortified and Tyrannicals, that opened up players to the willingness to play both Fortified and Tyrannical, on top of just rebalancing them over and over again and getting affix combos into states where they're okay. Because I think that, Tyran still normally has easier affix combos than Fortified, just generally. That's how it just goes. And I think that helps push people to play and be more okay with Tyrannical. And so I think that they're in an okay state. I'm pretty happy with them, similar to you.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary. Okay, how about Raging?
So Raging's an interesting one for me. So they added Overhaul and Oppressive Roar and Evoker this expansion. And so Raging has a decent amount of outplay potential. In addition to that, I think that they mostly have nerfed they've mostly nerfed like mobs that are enraged. They won't like one-shot you trash-wise normally.
Yeah, I think like Raging, there's a couple of mobs that should be not like the Shah and Temple of Jade Serpent. What's going on?
I don't think Amakaya needs to enrage either. Like that feels wrong.
Yeah, I wonder if so there's a couple of mobs like that where it's like, oh, it hits 30%, it rages, and if that happens right as it's casting something that kills you, you're gonna die.
Yeah.
Maybe Raging needs like a little bit of an arm time where it's like for 3 seconds it's got a soothable debuff, but doesn't actually get more damage. And then after that, it gets the extra damage. And if you soothe it during those 3 seconds, it doesn't gain the enrage.
On one hand, I'm actually kind of okay with Raging. On another hand, I think that it's kind of annoying that it limits your comp even further. Because you already have things that limit your composition, whether or not whatever tank is meta. That's normally the biggest limiting factor. Okay, you're going to be playing the best tank regardless. And so most of the time, they don't have a soothe because they're not playing Bear Druid. And then on top of that, you're playing with you have a lust of some capacity more often than not in your group. And so then you have another restriction where we at least need one Rage Dispel minimum. Ideally, we would have an AoE soothe, because that's kind of powerful on Raging. So I don't like it restricts your comp, but I do think that Raging is more often than not outplayable.
Quaking for me is one of the big annoying. Like I just hate playing against that affix. Kind of all the stuff it does, especially the interactions with the other stuff. We've already talked a little bit about that though.
I think it's one of the worst affixes, but again, I don't even know if it's an issue of like nerfing it. I think it's an issue of like this interacts with dungeons in a way that I don't like anymore, because I think it's going to dwarf the design space. Okay, so we just shouldn't design Wise Mari in a way where she doesn't have these platforms. Like, are we supposed to make the platforms bigger to allow people to fan out better for quaking? Like that doesn't feel right either. Like, are we supposed to really think about and preemptively think about every single boss before Quaking Week shows up and Bone Maw is killing people with Quaking? Or I can't see Quaking on underneath Herja's circle. There's so much wrong with Quaking. We could probably talk about Quaking for another 15 minutes. I think both you and I are down on Quaking hard.
Yeah.
Bursting.
Which other ones you want to talk about? We've covered a lot of these already.
Explosive,
passing,
I think. Yeah. I think explosive.
Explosive again. I think logarithmic scaling is needed on the really high pull counts.
Bolstering.
I don't know. Maybe these things should be just shielded from healer damage. So I guess healers being able to kill them is like fun for some healers.
What did you just say?
Just make the DPS do it, man. The DPS got to do something.
So one of the downsides of explosive, and it's actually kind of crazy, there are invisible time losses whenever you play with explosive.
Yeah.
Like really, like you would only notice it if you were scouring logs, doing the same run over and over again on explosive versus not. But like explosive, the amount of globals, dead melees, and healer damage lost is very, very high, especially in a like a coordinated group. And so I can't even imagine a non-coordinated group who are having DPS players in some situations actually hitting these explosives. You were going to end up losing a lot of damage, and I think that I mean, it's not the worst thing that they're losing damage, but it does feel weird that, okay, yeah, we played this perfectly and we lost 45 seconds over the course of the whole entire dungeon because of it.
Right. I think that's Sanguine? Probably a good spot. Yeah.
Any issues with Sanguine?
I think that Sanguine actually, I mean, it's like annoying to play against, but you know, it is good in skill testing, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess I'll give my final thoughts and then you can give yours. I think that in general, I think it would be okay if, let's say they just removed which one? If they removed this +7 level of affixes and only kept this +2 row of affixes and maybe changed up a couple of things and just like, you know, most of these are on death affixes in some capacity. If you only had to deal with some variation of on death affixes every single week, that feels like that would be a lot more reasonable. If they removed all these +7 affixes, which are more often than not the weird ones that have crazy interactions, I think that would feel a little bit more fair and then allow players to focus on playing the dungeons. Of course, dungeons would have to be rebalanced. Timers would have to be designed in a way that the dungeon's not going to be super free. But I don't think we would end up in a situation where dungeons are too easy. I think that it would just end up creating a situation where dungeons are a lot more fun.
Yeah, I guess I would be down to see some experimentation there. I think that if we had one affix, maybe adding a little bit more oomph to it. But for me, it's mostly just like seasonal affix changes. Yeah. And otherwise, I think that, yeah, like I think seeing like 2 new affixes and lob quaking or something. But yeah, what do you think? Let us know in the comments.
It sucks that we haven't had new affixes. We'll see you guys next week, though. Bye.
Bye.